You think you know a story about a hero, a lonely rancher, a damsel in distress, a snowy Wyoming mountain. But you don't know this story, not the real one, because the man who found her wasn't just a hero, and the woman tied to that fence post wasn't just a victim. And the three babies freezing in the snow, well, they were the key to a secret so dark it was about to soak the entire mountain in blood. The wind howled like a banshee through the high ridges of the Snowhorn Mountains. It was late January 1877, the kind of cold that steals the breath from your lungs and freezes it solid before it can escape. Silas Granger felt it in his bones, a familiar ache that had been his only companion for 10 long years. He pulled his horse, Ajax, to a stop, the crunch of snow under hooves the only sound for miles. Or so he thought. Then he heard it, faint, high-pitched and desperate. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. He'd lived on this mountain his whole life. He knew its sounds better than he knew his own name. This was different. This was the sound of something small and human, fighting for its life. He tilted his head, listening. The sound came again, sharper this time, slicing through the howl of the wind. A baby's cry? No. Wait. There was more than one. Silas swung himself down from the saddle, his boots sinking deep into the powder. The trail ahead was untouched, a white, unblemished scar through the timberline. Whoever was up here hadn't come by the main path. He took Ajax's reins and pushed forward, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The crying grew louder, more insistent, pulling him toward a small clearing just off the path. And that's when he saw it. A sight so brutal it made the bitter cold seem warm. A woman tied to an old half-rotted fence post. She was bound with barbed wire, the cruel metal biting deep into her wrists and forearms, her skin torn and bleeding. Snow clung to her eyelashes and froze in the strands of her hair. Her face was a mask of pale death, except for the violent purple bruises blooming across her cheekbones. She was barely conscious, her head lolling to one side. But it was what lay at her feet that made Silas's blood run cold. 3 bundles. 3 tiny swaddled infants, no older than a day, lying in the snow. One of them was letting out the weak, whimpering cry he'd heard. The other 2 were terrifyingly still. They were wrapped in what looked like the shredded remnants of a cotton nightgown, a pathetic defense against the killing frost. The woman's head moved, a flicker of life in the frozen tableau. Her cracked lips parted, and a whisper, thin as a spider's thread, reached him. "Don't let them take my daughters." Silas didn't hesitate. He dropped to one knee, ignoring the biting cold that seeped through his trousers. He ripped off his thick leather gloves, and his bare hands went to the babies first. He checked each one, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man with hands as calloused as his. The first, the crying one, was cold but breathing. The second, silent one, a shallow puff of air against his fingers, alive. The third, for a heart-stopping second, nothing. Then a faint, fluttery breath. All 3 were alive. For now. He looked back at the woman. The wire was wrapped so tight it had dug into the wood of the post. Whoever did this didn't just want to restrain her. They wanted her to suffer. They wanted her to die slowly, watching her children freeze before her very eyes. "You're coming with me," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through the wind. It wasn't a question. It was a promise. Her eyelids fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. It took a long moment for his words to register. He didn't wait for a reply. He pulled the hunting knife from his boot, its steel blade gleaming in the flat gray light. With a single fluid motion, he sliced through the ropes binding her ankles. Then he moved to the barbed wire. It was a nasty piece of work, rusted and sharp. He had to cut it strand by strand, pulling the barbs carefully from her flesh. Blood welled up, dark against the snow, but she didn't make a sound. Not a whimper, not a flinch. The kind of stillness that comes only after pain has burned away everything else. He cut the last strand, and her body slumped forward. He caught her, his arms wrapping around her waist. She was limp, a dead weight of exhaustion and blood loss. He scooped her up as if she weighed nothing, her head falling against his chest. Then one by one he gathered the babies. He unbuttoned his thick wool coat and tucked the 2 smallest ones inside against his own body, a desperate bid for warmth. The third he wrapped in a heavy blanket from his saddlebag and secured it tightly. The wind tore at them, a relentless physical force. He shielded them with his body, turning his back to the gale. His horse, Ajax, nickered nervously, stomping its feet. Silas glanced back at the trail. It was a half-mile back to his cabin, uphill, through knee-deep snow. Time was a luxury they didn't have. He adjusted his grip on the woman, tightened the wrap on the infant, and spoke, though not to her and not to the babies. He spoke to the mountain itself, to the storm, maybe even to God. "You don't die here," he whispered, his voice raw. "Not on my land." Getting back on the horse was a clumsy, desperate struggle. He managed it, settling the woman in front of him, the babies held securely between their bodies. She was terrifyingly light. The infants felt no heavier than newborn rabbits. The cold had already stolen so much from them. Every second was a battle. The ride back was a slow-motion nightmare. The wind was a physical enemy, trying to rip them from the saddle. But Silas was relentless. His focus narrowed to a single point: the small, dark shape of his cabin on the ridge. There was no time to ask questions. No time to wonder who she was, or what kind of monster had left her to die. There was only time to move, only time to fight the cold, only time to keep her alive. The cabin was dark and cold when they finally reached it, the embers in the hearth long dead. He didn't bother with the latch, just kicked the door open and carried her inside. He laid her gently on a bed of quilts and furs near the fireplace, then went back for the third baby. He placed all three in a wooden crate he'd lined with rabbit pelts, a makeshift cradle. Only then did he turn to the fire, his hands finally starting to shake, not from cold, but from the adrenaline draining out of him. He worked with a grim, silent efficiency. He stoked the embers, added kindling, and soon a small flame flickered to life, pushing back the oppressive cold. Outside, the snow fell harder, a thick white blanket that was already covering his tracks, erasing the path from the clearing of horrors. It was as if the mountain itself was trying to bury the secret of what had happened. But Silas knew. Secrets didn't stay buried on this mountain. They just froze, waiting for the spring thaw. And he had a terrible feeling that the monster who did this was far from finished. He'd brought a woman and her three daughters back from the dead, but he was starting to realize he might have just brought their killer right to his door. The cabin was little more than a box against the storm, 4 timber walls and a sloped roof groaning under the weight of the fresh snow. But it was dry, and the fire Silas had coaxed to life was now a roaring blaze, its warmth slowly, stubbornly crawling into the corners of the room. He hung his soaked coat by the hearth and peeled off his gloves, his hands raw and chapped. The woman lay on the bed of blankets, still unconscious. Her lips had a bluish tint, and her breathing was dangerously shallow. The babies had begun to stir, their whimpers low and weak, but it was the most beautiful sound Silas had ever heard. It was the sound of life. He found a jug of goat's milk he kept in the cool space behind a stack of firewood and poured some into a small iron pot, setting it near the fire to warm. He took a clean strip of linen from a chest, dipped it in a bucket of snow melt he'd warmed, and went to the woman. He knelt beside her and began to gently clean the dried blood from her wrists and forearms. The cuts from the barbed wire were deep and jagged, but as he cleaned, he saw something else. Beneath the fresh wounds on the delicate skin of her inner wrist was a mark that wasn't a cut. It was old, faded, but unmistakable. A brand. It was a simple shape, a circle with a cross through it, a cattle brand. But no ranch in Wyoming used a mark like that. This wasn't for livestock. This was for a person. What in God's name had happened to this woman? He pushed the thought aside. Keep her alive first. Ask questions later. He moved to her legs. The bruises were a sickening tapestry of purple and black, swelling along her shins. Someone had kicked her, over and over. He worked gently, cleaning the scrapes and cuts, his touch methodical. She didn't stir. Her breathing remained shallow, but it was steady. A small victory. The milk was warm now. He poured some into a tin bowl and carried it over to the makeshift cradle. The smallest of the 3 girls was crying in earnest now, a thin, reedy sound that tore at his heart. He crouched beside the crate, his large, rough hands surprisingly steady as he dipped a small, carved wooden spoon into the milk. He brought it to the baby's lips, letting a single drop fall into her mouth. She took it, then another, her tiny mouth working clumsily at first, then with a fierce, desperate greed. He fed the other two the same way, drop by precious drop, his entire world shrinking to the space of that small wooden crate. He was so focused on the babies that he almost missed it. A faint sound from the bed. He turned. The woman's eyelids were fluttering, her lips parted, and a single word, a hoarse whisper, escaped. Caleb. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a name. But a chill went down Silas's spine. Because he knew that name. He knew it all too well. Caleb was the name of his own brother. The brother who had vanished without a trace 5 years ago, leaving nothing behind but a cold trail and 1,000 unanswered questions. He crossed the room in 2 strides, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knelt beside her. "I'm Silas," he said, his voice low, trying to keep the shock out of it. "You're safe." Her eyes, a pale, haunted blue, finally focused on him. They were filled with a confusion that quickly turned to fear. Her lips moved again, but this time no sound came out. Her gaze slid past him, to the crate of babies, now quiet and sleeping in the warm glow of the fire. One of them let out a tiny sneeze. The woman's eyes filled with tears, but she was too broken, too exhausted to sob. They just spilled silently down her cheeks. Silas stood up, his mind reeling. Caleb. She had said Caleb. It had to be a coincidence. It had to be. There were other Calebs in the world, but here, on his mountain, it felt like a ghost had just walked into the room. He forced himself to move, to act normal. He went to a large wooden trunk at the foot of his bed and pulled out a thick fur cloak, one made from elk hide and lined with the softest rabbit fur. He brought it to the basket and gently tucked it around the sleeping children, adding another layer of warmth. When he looked back at the woman, she was watching him, her expression unreadable. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod, then returned to the hearth and added another log to the fire. Sparks shot up into the chimney, like fleeting, fiery stars. Time stretched on, marked only by the crackle of the flames and the slow, even breathing of the 4 souls he had pulled back from the edge. Later, as he was about to settle into his chair for the night, her voice came again, a little stronger this time. "My name is Maribel," she said, her voice raspy. "Maribel Quinn." Silas froze. Quinn. That was the other name that haunted this mountain. Joseph Quinn was a land baron from the lowlands, a man who bought up property with a ruthless hunger, a man known for his cold ambition and even colder heart. A man Silas suspected had something to do with his brother's disappearance. He kept his back to her, staring into the flames, his hands clenched into fists. A woman branded with a strange mark, who whispers his lost brother's name, who claims her last name is Quinn, found half dead with triplet girls on his land. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a message, and he was beginning to think he was the only one who could read it. The storm outside finally quieted, leaving a heavy, muffled silence. Inside the cabin, the only sounds were the low hum of the fire and the soft breathing of the infants. Maribel was propped up against a pile of blankets, some color returning to her face. The bruises were still stark against her pale skin, dark ink stains telling a story of unspeakable violence. Silas sat across the room, sharpening the blade of his hunting knife with slow, rhythmic strokes against a whetstone. The sound was steady, calming, but it did nothing to soothe the turmoil in his mind. Maribel Quinn, who had whispered the name Caleb. He hadn't pressed her. He hadn't asked a single question. He was playing a long game now. He needed her to trust him. He needed her to tell him the truth, not the story she thought he wanted to hear. "I was 17 when I married Joseph Quinn," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet. It was hoarse but clear. "He was 34, rich, powerful. My father said I was lucky." Silas didn't look up. He kept the knife moving against the stone. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The rhythm of a man biding his time. "I thought I was lucky too," she continued, her voice hollow. "He gave me a big house, silk dresses, but he was cold. He never touched me with kindness." She paused, her gaze drifting to the sleeping babies. "When my first daughter was born, he frowned. When the second came, He stopped speaking to me altogether. Her voice trembled, cracking on the next words. After the third, he called the midwife a witch, said she'd cursed my womb. Silas finally stopped sharpening the knife. He looked up, his eyes locking onto hers. They were calm, steady, betraying none of the chaos inside him. He just waited. He told his brothers, I was no better than a mule, she whispered, shame and pain warring in her voice. Useless if I couldn't give him a son. That night, they beat me. She turned her head slightly, and in the firelight, he could see a faint silvery scar along her jawline. An old wound. This wasn't the first time. I thought he would kill me, but instead, he dragged me out to that fence post. Said if the snow didn't take me, I was meant to live. He called it God's justice. Her hands were shaking. She reached one out, as if to touch her daughter's, but let it fall back into her lap. They said girls are nothing but mouths to feed. The words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Silas set the knife down on the floor beside him. He stood up, his tall frame seeming to fill the small cabin. He crossed the room and knelt beside her cot. He reached for her hand. It was swollen and bruised, the knuckles scabbed over from her struggle against the wire. He took it gently, cradling it in his own large weathered palm. Here, he said, his voice low and certain, his gaze unwavering. Your girls are the only thing worth feeding. Tears welled in Maribel's eyes, and this time, she didn't try to stop them. They streamed down her face, a silent testament to her suffering. Silas stayed there, kneeling beside her, holding her hand, his presence a quiet, solid anchor in the storm of her life. But even as he offered her comfort, his mind was racing. Her story was plausible, horrifyingly so. Joseph Quinn was more than capable of such cruelty, but it didn't explain everything. It didn't explain the brand. It didn't explain why she'd whispered his brother's name. And as he looked at the three sleeping infants, a new disturbing thought began to take root. They were tiny, yes, but even now he could see differences. One had a dusting of hair so blonde it was almost white. Another's was a dark, rich brown. The third was somewhere in between. It was possible, of course, but it was also unusual. He was comforting a victim, yes, but he was also harboring a mystery that connected the most powerful man in the valley, his long-lost brother, and three innocent children. Maribel thought she had found a savior in him. What she didn't know was that Silas Granger wasn't just a rancher. He was a hunter, and he had just found a trail he'd thought was cold for 5 years. The story she told him was tragic, but he was certain it wasn't the whole truth, and he would get the rest of it, one way or another. Because Joseph Quinn had taken something from him once before, and Silas would be damned if he let him do it again. The days that followed were a quiet dance of survival and suspicion. Maribel slowly regained her strength. The color returned to her cheeks, the light to her eyes. She moved with a quiet efficiency, tending to the babies, stoking the fire, and patching up Silas's old clothes with a neatness that spoke of a life before this nightmare. She never spoke of Joseph Quinn again, and Silas never asked. They existed in a space of unspoken questions, a fragile truce built on the shared goal of keeping 3 tiny heartbeats going. Silas watched her. He watched the way she cared for the girls, her touch always gentle, her voice a soft hum of lullabies. She was a good mother. He couldn't deny that. But he also saw the shadows in her eyes, the way she would sometimes stare into the fire, lost in a place he couldn't go. He saw the way her hand would instinctively go to her wrist, tracing the spot where the brand was hidden beneath the healing cuts. She was hiding something. He was sure of it. One afternoon, he was outside splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a counterpoint to the silence of the mountains. He saw Maribel through the cabin window, rocking one of the babies. He stopped, leaning on the axe handle, and just watched. The baby in her arms was the one with the pale blonde hair. She was cooing at it, a genuine, loving smile on her face. Then she moved to the next baby in the cradle, the one with the dark brown hair. She fed her, changed her, but the smile was different. It was still kind, but it lacked the same effortless warmth. It was the subtle, almost imperceptible difference a man who lives alone and observes everything would notice. He went back to his work, the axe splitting logs with a new sharp violence. A chilling theory began to form in his mind, a theory so monstrous he almost dismissed it. What if? What if not all the babies were hers? That night, after Maribel and the children were asleep, Silas did something he knew he would regret. He lit a small lantern, turning the wick down so low it cast only a faint, ghostly light. He crept over to the makeshift cradle. The three girls were sleeping soundly, their tiny chests rising and falling in unison. He reached in, his hand trembling slightly, and gently unwrapped the swaddling on the dark-haired baby. His heart was pounding. He didn't know what he was looking for. A birthmark, a resemblance, anything. And then he found it. Sewn into the inner hem of the baby's shredded nightgown was a tiny folded piece of oilskin, no bigger than his thumb. It was so small, so cleverly hidden, it would have been missed by anyone not looking for something out of place. His fingers fumbled with the knot, his breath held tight in his chest. He finally worked it free and unfolded the small packet. Inside was not a document, not a letter, but a small, tarnished silver locket. He carefully pried it open. On one side was a miniature portrait of a young woman he didn't recognize, with kind eyes and dark hair. On the other side, facing her, was a portrait of a man he knew as well as his own reflection. It was his brother, Caleb. The air left his lungs in a rush. It was all connected. It was all real. This woman, Maribel, had lied to him from the very beginning. The baby with the dark hair, the baby she held with a touch of distance. It was Caleb's. This wasn't just a story of a cruel husband. This was a story of murder, of stolen children, and secrets that went deeper than he could possibly imagine. He looked from the locket in his hand to the sleeping woman across the room. She wasn't just a victim seeking refuge. She was a woman who held the key to what happened to his brother. And Joseph Quinn didn't just want his wife back. He wanted to bury a secret. He wanted to bury the last living piece of Caleb Granger. The snow began to melt, turning the pristine white drifts into gray, muddy slush. Spring was clawing its way up the mountain, and with it came word from the lowlands. The knock on the cabin door came just after dawn, sharp and urgent. Silas opened it to find a woman bundled in a thick green shawl, her cheeks flushed from a hard ride. "Hattie," Silas said, his voice flat. He stepped aside to let her in. Hattie was his sister. She lived down in the valley, closer to the town, closer to the whispers and rumors that floated on the wind. She stomped the mud from her boots, and her sharp eyes immediately found Maribel, who was sitting by the fire, feeding one of the babies. Hattie's gaze was hard, assessing. She turned back to Silas. "It's him," she said, her voice low and tight. "Joseph Quinn. He's put the word out." Silas showed no surprise. He just closed the door, the heavy thud sealing them inside. "He's telling everyone she's his wife, Maribel, that she ran off in a mad fit," Hattie continued, pulling off her gloves. "Says she's unstable. He's got a writ from the judge in town, the one on his payroll, saying the babies are his property and she's holding them against the law." Maribel's face went pale. Her hand tightened on the baby in her arms. "He's hired men, Silas." Hattie's voice dropped even lower. "4 of them. They're telling folks they're just a rescue party, here to bring a poor, confused mother back home. But I saw them ride out. They ain't a rescue party. They're a posse." Silas gave a single sharp nod. He'd been expecting this. Ever since he'd found the locket, he knew Quinn wouldn't just let this go. This wasn't about a runaway wife. This was about silencing the truth. "They'll find this place," Hattie warned, her eyes darting from her brother to the woman by the fire. "It's only a matter of time." "Let them come," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "They won't be taking anyone." Hattie looked between them, a silent question in her eyes. She didn't know the whole story, not yet. She didn't know about Caleb. Silas hadn't told her. He was holding his cards close to his chest. Hattie sighed, then reached into her coat and pulled out a leather pouch. "Dried meat, some cornmeal. You'll need it." She pressed it into his hand. After she left, a heavy silence fell over the cabin. The threat was no longer a ghost. It had a name, and it was riding toward them. Maribel looked at Silas, her eyes wide with a terror that was all too real. But mingled with the fear was something else. A question. She had seen the way he'd reacted to Hattie's news. Not with shock, but with a grim certainty, as if he was waiting for a war he knew was coming. That day, Silas became a different man. The quiet rancher was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating soldier. He reinforced the door with a heavy iron crossbar. He boarded up the rear window, leaving only a small slit to see through. He took his rifle down from the wall, cleaned and oiled it with a methodical precision that was terrifying to watch. He moved with a purpose that went beyond just protecting a stranger. This was personal. When night fell, the air in the cabin was thick with tension. Every creak of the wood, every howl of the wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. Maribel didn't sleep. She sat in a chair by the cradle, a heavy iron poker resting in her lap. Silas sat by the door, his rifle across his knees, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside. He finally broke the silence, his voice soft but sharp as a razor's edge. "You need to tell me everything," he said, not looking at her. "Not the story you told me before. The real one." Maribel flinched as if he'd struck her. I don't know what you mean." Silas finally turned his head, his gaze pinning her in place. "The baby," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The one with the dark hair. The locket. Tell me about Caleb." The color drained from Maribel's face. She looked as if she'd seen a ghost. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The poker fell from her lap, clattering loudly on the stone hearth. The lie she had so carefully constructed had just been shattered into a million pieces. She wasn't trapped in the cabin with a kind stranger. She was trapped with a man who knew her secret, a man whose brother she had failed to save, and the killers were riding up the mountain to finish the job. The sound of the falling poker seemed to echo in the crushing silence. Maribel stared at Silas, her face a mask of shock and terror. The walls of the cabin, which had been her sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The man who had been her protector was now her judge. "How?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "The locket," Silas said, his voice devoid of emotion. "It was sewn into the baby's clothes. Now you're going to tell me what happened to my brother. And you're going to tell me why Joseph Quinn wants you and that child dead." Tears streamed down Maribel's face as the truth, the real, ugly truth, finally came pouring out. Her name wasn't Maribel Quinn. It was Ilara. Just Ilara. She had been an orphan, taken in by a small, independent ranching family, the family Quinn had wanted to force out. Caleb Granger had been working for them as a ranch hand, trying to make a new start after a falling out with Silas years ago. Ilara and Caleb had fallen in love, a secret, desperate love in the shadow of Quinn's greed. Joseph Quinn didn't want the land just for grazing. There were rumors of silver in the hills, and Quinn wanted it all. He'd tried to buy the family out, then threatened them. When they refused to buckle, he'd taken a more direct approach. He and his men had ambushed Ilara's adoptive father and brothers, killing them in what was passed off as a cattle-rustling dispute. Caleb knew it was murder. He'd gathered proof, a signed ledger, witness testimonies, and was planning to take it to a federal marshal in the next territory. "But Quinn found out," Ilara sobbed, her body shaking. "He found Caleb before he could leave. He killed him, Silas. He shot him right in front of me." Silas's face was stone, but his knuckles were white where he gripped his rifle. "Quinn didn't know I was pregnant," she continued, her voice ragged. "He took me, kept me locked up in his house. His real wife had died years before, childless. He was obsessed with having an heir. He forced me. She couldn't finish the sentence. She took a shuddering breath. "He married me in a sham ceremony, performed by his corrupt judge. He gave me a new name, Maribel Quinn, and told me my old life was over." The story got darker. Ilara had given birth, not to triplets, but to a single, healthy baby girl, Caleb's daughter. But in the very same week, two other women on Quinn's vast estate, wives of indebted workers, had also given birth to girls. Quinn, in a fit of rage at not getting a son from any of them, had hatched a twisted plan. He'd stolen the other two infants, intending to raise all three as his own, a bizarre collection of daughters, hiding the truth of their parentage forever. He would control them, marry them off to his allies, and consolidate his power. Caleb's child would be his ultimate prize, the final insult to the man who had dared to defy him. "But he underestimated me," Ilara whispered, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "I knew he would eventually kill me to erase the last link to Caleb. So I took all three babies and I ran. I didn't know where to go. I just ran toward the mountains, toward the only name Caleb ever mentioned when he spoke of family. Granger. So that's what this was. This wasn't just a rescue. This was a reckoning. Silas was not just protecting a victim. He was sheltering the last piece of his brother, the evidence of his murder, and two other stolen children. The posse coming up the mountain wasn't just a group of hired thugs. They were a death squad sent to erase a crime. As if on cue, a sound cut through the night, the distant baying of hounds. Quinn wasn't just riding, he was hunting. "They're here," Silas said, his voice a low growl. He stood up and walked to the boarded window, peering through the small slit. In the pale moonlight, he could see them. 4 riders at the edge of the timberline, holding back, with a pack of hounds sniffing the ground, their forms dark and predatory against the snow. "Stay away from the window," he commanded Alara. "Keep the babies quiet. No matter what you hear, you do not open that door." He moved with a quiet, deadly grace. He grabbed a second rifle, a heavy buffalo gun, from its pegs on the wall, and a satchel of ammunition. He checked the iron crossbar on the door, making sure it was secure. Then he walked to the stone fireplace. He reached up, feeling along the mantelpiece until his fingers found a loose stone. He pulled it free, revealing a dark, hollow space within the chimney. From it, he pulled out a worn leather gun belt and a heavy Colt revolver, its handle worn smooth from use. This was not the gear of a simple rancher. This was the gear of a man who had seen battle, the gear of a man who knew how to kill. Elora stared at him, her eyes wide. "Who are you?" she whispered. Silas buckled the gun belt around his waist, the familiar weight settling on his hips. He didn't answer her directly. He just looked at her, his eyes as cold and hard as the Wyoming winter. "Joseph Quinn made a mistake," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He didn't just murder my brother and come after his child. He came to my mountain, and people who come to my mountain looking for a fight tend to stay here." He walked to the back of the cabin to a small heavy trap door in the floor that Elara hadn't noticed before. It led to a root cellar. "Get in," he said. "Take the girls. There are supplies down there. It's deep enough that a stray bullet won't find you." She hesitated, clutching Caleb's daughter to her chest. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to introduce Mr. Quinn to some mountain justice," Silas said, pulling back the heavy bolt on the cabin door. "He wanted a war. I'm just here to give him one." He didn't wait for her to move. He slipped out the door and vanished into the darkness, leaving her alone with the sound of the approaching hounds and the terrifying realization that her rescuer was just as dangerous as the men hunting her. The night was preternaturally still, the moon a sliver of bone behind a thin veil of clouds. The only sounds were the eager yelps of the hounds as they closed in and the crunch of Silas's boots on the crusted snow. He didn't run. He moved with a hunter's economy, gliding between the dark trunks of the pines, his form melting into the shadows. He knew this land. Every rock, every tree, every gully. It was his. And these men were trespassers. He circled wide, coming up behind the posse. They had reined in their horses at the edge of the clearing, just out of rifle range of the cabin. 4 riders, as Hattie had said. One of them, a large man with a thick beard, held the leashes of 3 massive, snarling hounds. Silas recognized him. Abe Carter, a brutal thug who worked as Quinn's enforcer. The man next to him was Slider, with a nervous energy. And in the front, sitting tall in his expensive saddle, was Joseph Quinn himself. Cold, arrogant, his face illuminated by the faint moonlight. But it was the 4th man that made Silas's blood run cold. He was dressed in black, with a silver star pinned to his chest. Sheriff Barrows. The law in this county was not just on Quinn's payroll. It was riding with him. There would be no appeal to justice. Justice was a lie. "She's in there," Carter grunted, pointing at the dark cabin. "Dogs have the scent." "Of course she is," Quinn said, his voice cutting and clear in the cold air. "The fool thinks this mountain will protect her. Barrows, you're the law. You go knock." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Joseph, maybe we wait for morning. A frontal approach is risky." "Are you questioning my orders, Sheriff?" Quinn's voice was laced with ice. "You have a warrant. You serve it. Or is that star just for show?" Silas raised his rifle. the cold metal a familiar comfort against his cheek. He centered the sight on Sheriff Barrows's chest. He could end this right now. One shot and the lawman was down. But that would start a firefight, and a stray bullet could hit the cabin. He had to be smarter. He had to use the mountain. He lowered the rifle and faded back into the trees. He moved silently, his path sure in the darkness, to a rocky outcrop that overlooked the clearing from the side. From here, he had a perfect vantage point. He laid the heavy buffalo gun on a flat rock, its long barrel pointing directly at the group of men. This wasn't a weapon for a close-quarters fight. This was a weapon for sending a message. Sheriff Barrows dismounted reluctantly and began walking toward the cabin, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Maribel Quinn," he called out, his voice sounding thin and uncertain. "This is Sheriff Barrows. I have a warrant for your arrest. Come out with your hands empty." Silence. "Damn it, woman, don't make this difficult." "Ekgasuri," he shouted, growing bolder as he got closer to the porch. That's when Silas decided it was time to announce his presence. He didn't aim for the sheriff. He didn't aim for Quinn. He aimed for the lantern hanging from Quinn's saddle. The buffalo gun roared, a deafening boom that shattered the night's silence. The sound echoed off the mountains, rolling like thunder through the valley. Before the sound even finished its journey, the lantern exploded in a shower of glass and burning oil. The horses screamed and reared, plunging the scene into near-total darkness. "Ambush!" Carter yelled, dropping the leashes as he fumbled for his gun. The hounds, now free, surged forward, barking furiously as they charged the cabin. "Find him!" Quinn roared, his voice tight with fury as he fought to control his terrified horse. Silas didn't wait. He abandoned the heavy buffalo gun and melted back into the forest, his Colt revolver now in his hand. The hounds were the first threat. They would tear that door to shreds. He let them get close, let their bloodlust focus entirely on the cabin. Then he stepped out from behind a thick pine, not 10 yards from them. "Here, boys," he called, his voice calm. The lead hound spun, its eyes gleaming in the dark, and launched itself at him, jaws wide. The colt barked once. The hound dropped in a heap. The second one came, and the third. 2 more shots, clean and precise. The woods fell silent again, save for the panicked whinnying of the horses and the enraged shouts of the men. He had just killed 3 valuable hunting dogs with 3 perfect shots in the dark. He had announced his skill and his lethality. This was not some scared farmer protecting his home. This was something else entirely. "Show yourself, Granger!" Quinn bellowed into the darkness. "You can't hide forever." Silas smiled grimly in the shadows. He wasn't hiding. He was hunting. He fired a 4th shot, not at a man, but at a dead branch hanging over Abe Carter's head. The heavy branch cracked and crashed down, missing the enforcer by inches but sending his horse into a frenzy. Carter was thrown from the saddle, landing hard in the snow with a curse. One man down without firing a single shot at him. The sheriff and the other man were firing blindly into the trees, their muzzle flashes lighting up the woods in brief, frantic bursts. They were wasting ammunition. They were panicking. This was his element, not theirs. "Fall back," Quinn commanded. "Fall back to the trail." Silas watched them go, a chaotic retreat of terrified men and horses. Quinn, Carter, the sheriff, and the 4th man, all vanishing back down the path. He stayed perfectly still in the darkness, listening until the sound of their hoofbeats faded completely. He knew this wasn't over. This was just the opening salvo. Quinn was arrogant, but he wasn't a fool. He would be back, and he would come with more men. He would come ready for a war. Silas returned to the cabin, the cold seeping back into his bones. He opened the door and saw Alara at the top of the cellar ladder, her face pale, a baby clutched in her arms. "Are they gone?" she whispered. "For now," he said, bolting the door behind him. He looked at her, at the stolen children, at the cabin that was now a fortress. The fight for survival was over. The war for his brother's legacy had just begun, and he had a sinking feeling that Joseph Quinn wasn't the only enemy he had to worry about. The 4th rider, the one who had stayed quiet and in the shadows, there was something familiar about him, something that stirred a memory Silas had long tried to bury. He had a feeling this fight was about to get a lot more personal. The sun rose on a world of carnage and cold steel, The bodies of the three hounds lay in the snow, frozen monuments to the night's violence. Silas had dragged them away from the cabin, his expression grim. He worked with a feverish intensity, knowing the reprieve was temporary. Quinn would not accept defeat. He would regroup, reassess, and return with overwhelming force. Inside, Alara was a bundle of frayed nerves. She had come up from the cellar, but the cabin no longer felt safe. She watched Silas as he moved, his actions precise and chillingly calm. He was cleaning his weapons, laying out ammunition, and barricading the single window with thick planks from his workbench. He was preparing for a siege. "We can't just stay here," she said, her voice tight with panic. "He'll come back with more men. He'll burn the cabin down around us." "Let him try," Silas said without looking up from the rifle he was oiling. "This mountain has more surprises than an old badger's den." "What does that mean? What are you planning?" Silas finally stopped his work and looked at her. His eyes were hard, but there was a flicker of something else in their depths. Regret, maybe. Or sorrow for the man he was being forced to become again. "Years ago," he began, his voice low, "before I settled here, I didn't live a quiet life. I rode with a company of men who specialized in recovering assets. We weren't lawmen, but we weren't outlaws either. We worked for the banks, the railroads. We hunted men who ran. Men like Quinn." Ilara stared, speechless. The lonely rancher, the quiet mountain man, was a facade. Beneath it was a tracker, a bounty hunter, a man who knew the art of the fight. "My brother Caleb," Silas continued, "he couldn't stand the life. He said it was eating away at my soul. We had a falling out. He left. He wanted a clean life, a peaceful life, the kind of life he tried to build with you." His gaze softened for a fraction of a second. "Quinn took that from him, and now he's trying to take it from his daughter. I won't let that happen." He told her his plan. It was audacious, bordering on suicidal. He wasn't going to wait for Quinn's attack. He was going to take the fight to him. Under the cover of the next night, he was going to slip down the mountain. He knew Quinn's ranch, knew the layout. He also knew Quinn's greatest weakness, his arrogance. Quinn would have men guarding the perimeter, but he would feel safest in his own home, surrounded by his wealth and power. "I'm going for the ledger," Silas said. "The proof Caleb gathered. You said Quinn killed him right in front of you. Where?" "In the study," Alara whispered, the memory making her tremble. "The big house. Quinn. He keeps a safe behind a painting of his father." "That's where it'll be," Silas said with grim certainty. "Men like Quinn, they're narcissists. They can't stand to destroy the proof of their victories. He'd keep it, look at it, gloat over it." He looked at Alara. "But I need you here. I'm going to create a diversion, a big one. It will draw most of his men away from the main house. But he'll leave a few. If they come for the cabin while I'm gone, you have to be ready." He showed her how to use a shotgun he kept loaded with rock salt. "It won't kill them, but it'll make them wish they were dead. Aim for the chest. It'll feel like they've been kicked by a mule." He also gave her a small pistol. "This one will kill. Don't use it unless they get through the door. One shot, center mass. Don't hesitate." The reality of her situation crashed down on Alara. She wasn't just a mother protecting her children. She was the last line of defense. The lonely cabin was the Alamo, and she was its sole defender. That night, as darkness fell, Silas prepared to leave. He dressed in dark clothing, his face smeared with ash from the fireplace. He was a ghost, a wraith ready to slip through the night. He paused at the door and looked back at Alara, who stood by the cradle, the shotgun held awkwardly in her hands. "Remember what Caleb was fighting for?" he said softly. "You're not just protecting his child. You're protecting his honor." He slipped out the door and was gone, swallowed by the immense dark wilderness. Ilara was alone, truly alone, with 3 sleeping babies, a shotgun, a pistol, and the terrifying knowledge that a private army was on its way. The minutes stretched into hours. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. Every shadow seemed to take the shape of a man. She sat in the dark, her heart pounding, a frantic rhythm against her ribs, and waited. Suddenly, a bright orange glow lit up the horizon far down the mountain. It flickered and grew, a malevolent eye opening in the darkness. Silas's diversion. He had set a fire. It looked like he had torched an entire barn or a storehouse. It was a massive blaze, big enough to be seen for miles, big enough to draw every available hand to fight it. A grim satisfaction settled in her heart. He was a man of his word, but the satisfaction was short-lived. A new sound reached her. Not the wind, not an animal. The unmistakable crunch of boots on snow coming from the back of the cabin. They hadn't all gone to the fire. Quinn had left someone behind, just as Silas had predicted. She crept to the back wall, her breath held tight in her chest, and peered through the small slit in the boarded-up window. Two figures were moving through the trees, their rifles held at the ready. They were avoiding the front door, circling around for a surprise attack. Her blood ran cold. She raised the shotgun, the heavy weapon feeling clumsy and alien in her hands. Her finger found the trigger. They were getting closer. 10 yards. 5. They reached the back wall of the cabin, pressing themselves against the timber, right below the window. They were preparing to breach. She could hear them whispering. This was it. It was her or them. With a silent prayer to a god she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, she took a deep breath, aimed the shotgun at the door, and waited for the splintering of wood that would signal the start of her own private war. The splintering crash came at the side door, not the back. They had tricked her. One man had made noise at the back while another, bigger one, slammed his full weight against the cabin's weakest point. The old wood groaned and shattered, the door flying inward off its hinges. A massive figure stood silhouetted against the night, a rifle in his hands. It was Abe Carter, Quinn's monstrous enforcer. Ilara didn't have time to think. She spun, leveling the shotgun. Carter saw her, a cruel sneer spreading across his face as he raised his rifle. She pulled the trigger. The shotgun roared, the recoil slamming her back against the wall. Carter screamed, a high-pitched shriek of agony, as the rock salt tore through his thick coat and into his chest. He dropped his rifle, clutching at his torso, stumbling backward out of the doorway. But the second man was already there. He scrambled past the wounded Carter, diving into the room. It was the fourth rider from the night before, the one Silas had found so familiar. In the dim firelight, Ilara saw his face clearly for the first time, and a gasp of pure shock escaped her lips. He wasn't some hired thug. He was Caleb, or rather, a twisted, scarred version of him. One side of his face was a ruin of scar tissue, his eye milky and blind. He moved with a limp, his body bent and broken. He looked at her, and there was no recognition in his good eye, only a cold, dead emptiness. "Caleb?" she whispered, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. He didn't answer. He lunged for her. He wasn't trying to kill her. He was going for the baby, Caleb's daughter, who was crying in the cradle. This wasn't a rescue. This wasn't a return. This was an abduction. Meanwhile, miles away, Silas was moving through the chaos he had created. The fire at Quinn's lumber mill was raging, drawing every man on the ranch like moss to a flame. He slipped through the unguarded perimeter of the main house, a shadow among shadows. He scaled a trellis to a second-floor balcony, pried open a window, and slipped inside. The house was opulent, filled with dark wood and velvet, a monument to a rich man's ego. He moved silently through the corridors, his knife in one hand, his revolver in the other. He found the study. It was exactly as Ilara had described it. A massive oak desk, shelves of leather-bound books, and a large, imposing portrait of a grim-faced old man hanging over the fireplace. Joseph Quinn's father. He took the painting down. Behind it was a heavy iron safe, locked. He hadn't expected it to be easy. He took a small leather pouch from his belt. It contained a set of specialized tools, picks, tension wrenches, the tools of his former trade. He knelt before the safe and went to work, his touch delicate, his ears listening for the faint clicks of the tumblers. The first click, the second, the third. He was close. He felt the tension in the mechanism shift. Then he heard it, a floorboard creaking in the hallway behind him. He froze. He hadn't been detected. He was a ghost. It was impossible. He slowly drew his revolver, turning his head just enough to see the doorway. A figure stood there, holding a lantern. It wasn't a guard. It was Joseph Quinn. He hadn't gone to the fire. He was smiling, a cold, predatory smile. "I've been expecting you, Granger," Quinn said, his voice smooth as silk. "You didn't really think it would be this easy, did you?" In his other hand, he held a pistol, aimed directly at Silas's heart. "You see," Quinn continued, taking a step into the room, "I know all about your past. I know you were a hunter of men. I also knew you'd come for this." He gestured to the safe. "But the real prize isn't in there. The real prize came to you." Silas's mind raced. It was a trap. The fire, the guards being pulled away. It was all a setup. Quinn had wanted him here. "You're wondering about your brother, aren't you?" Quinn said, his smile widening. "Wondering how I got him to work for me. It was quite simple, really. I didn't kill him that day. I just broke him. A man can endure a great deal of pain before his mind snaps. His loyalty, his memory, his very identity, it all just washes away. He's my most loyal servant now. He doesn't even remember his own name. And right now, he's up on that mountain, retrieving my property, my daughter." The blood drained from Silas's face. He had left Ilara and the babies to face a monster. The monster who used to be his brother. He was trapped. Quinn had him dead to rights. And up on the mountain, his brother's ghost was about to steal his brother's child. And Ilara was the only one standing in his way. The study was a tomb. The silence broken only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Quinn's pistol was steady, his eyes glinting with triumph. Silas was on his knees, his own gun useless on the floor. He had walked into the perfect trap. "You lose, Granger," Quinn sneered. "I get the girl, the land she's the heir to, and the satisfaction of watching you die, knowing your own brother helped me do it." Silas looked at the gun, then at Quinn's smug face. And he did something Quinn didn't expect. He smiled, a slow, cold, grim smile. "You talk too much," Silas said. And then he threw himself sideways, not away from the gun, but toward the fireplace. It was a desperate, insane move. Quinn, startled by the sudden action, fired. The bullet tore through the air where Silas had been a second before, shattering a porcelain vase on the mantelpiece. Silas crashed into the heavy iron fireplace tools, sending them clattering to the floor. He grabbed the heaviest one, a thick iron poker, and lunged. He didn't aim for Quinn. He swung the poker with all his might at the heavy chain, holding the massive, ornate chandelier in the center of the room. The iron chain snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The chandelier, a half-ton monstrosity of brass and crystal, plunged from the ceiling. Quinn cried out, trying to leap back, but he was too slow. The chandelier crashed down, pinning him beneath its weight, his leg crushed at an unnatural angle. His pistol flew from his hand, skittering across the polished wood floor. Silas didn't hesitate. He scooped up Quinn's gun and stood over the trapped, screaming man. "The trap only works if the prey is stupid," Silas growled, pressing the barrel of the gun to Quinn's forehead. "Now where is the real ledger?" Back at the cabin, the scene was one of primal chaos. Ilara scrambled away from the man who wore her dead lover's face. This broken Caleb moved with a single-minded purpose, his good eye fixed on the crying baby in the cradle. He was a puppet, his strings pulled by a master miles away. "Caleb, please!" Ilara cried, trying to get between him and the cradle. "It's me, Ilara. Remember me. This is your daughter." He shoved her aside with a strength that was shocking, his face a mask of blank confusion. He reached the cradle, his scarred hands reaching for the child. Ilara knew she had only one choice, the choice Silas had given her. She grabbed the pistol from the table. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold it. This was Caleb, the man she had loved, the father of her child. But the man in front of her was not him. He was a shell, a weapon aimed at his own flesh and blood. To save Caleb's daughter, she would have to kill Caleb's ghost. She raised the pistol, tears streaming down her face. "Forgive me," she whispered. But before she could pull the trigger, a new voice cut through the chaos. "Drop it, brother." A figure stood in the shattered doorway. It was the other man, the one who had been with Abe Carter at the back of the cabin. But he wasn't a hired thug. It was Hattie, Silas's sister, dressed in men's clothing, her face grim, a hunting rifle in her hands aimed squarely at the broken Caleb. "Hattie?" Ilara gasped. Silas wasn't the only one who didn't trust that the fight was over, Hattie said, her eyes never leaving the man who was once her brother. I circled back. Knew Quinn would pull a snake's move. She looked at the scarred man. Caleb, I don't know if you can hear me, but you will not take that child. The broken Caleb seemed to hesitate, his head twitching as if fighting a war within himself. The sound of Hattie's voice, a voice from his long-lost past, had struck a chord deep inside the wreckage of his mind. He looked from Hattie to Alara, then down at the baby. A flicker of something, pain, confusion, memory crossed his face. His hand, which had been reaching for the child, slowly fell to his side. It was in that moment of hesitation that the ground began to shake. A low, deep rumble started, growing louder and louder. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a sound Silas had warned Hattie about, a danger unique to these mountains in the spring. An avalanche. The diversion fire Silas had set, combined with the unseasonably warm day, had destabilized the massive snowpack on the upper ridge. Now tons of snow, ice, and rock were thundering down the mountainside, heading directly for them. The roar was deafening, a force of nature unleashed. The cabin, their fortress, was directly in its path. The roar of the avalanche was the sound of the world ending. Hattie grabbed Alara by the arm. "The cellar!" she screamed over the noise. "Now!" Alara scooped Caleb's daughter from the cradle, grabbing the other two as Hattie held the trapdoor open. They scrambled down the ladder into the darkness below just as the front wall of the cabin exploded inward. A tidal wave of snow, timber, and rock surged into the room, obliterating everything in an instant. The last thing they saw before Hattie slammed the heavy cellar door shut was the broken Caleb, standing perfectly still, not even trying to save himself. He just watched the wall of white consume him, a strange, almost peaceful expression on his face. The roar was absolute, and then silence. A heavy, profound silence, broken only by the terrified cries of the babies in the pitch-black, buried cellar. Miles away, Silas felt the tremor in the earth. He knew immediately what it was. He stood over the whimpering Joseph Quinn, the ledger, the real one, retrieved from a hidden compartment in the desk, tucked safely inside his coat. Quinn's leg was shattered, his arrogance replaced by pathetic, pain-filled moans. "That sound?" Silas said, his voice cold as the grave. "That's the mountain. She has a way of settling debts." He didn't kill Quinn. That would have been too easy. He simply walked out of the study, leaving Quinn pinned and helpless, and set the room on fire. He walked out of the burning mansion without a backward glance, melting back into the night as the flames lit up the sky. A funeral pyre for a tyrant's empire. He rode Ajax hard, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He didn't know what he would find. The cabin's location was right in the avalanche's primary path. He feared the worst. He arrived to a scene of utter devastation. Where his home had once stood, there was now a mountain of snow and debris 20 feet high. It was a grave. He fell to his knees, the ledger feeling worthless in his coat. He had won. He had gotten justice for Caleb, but he had lost everything else. He stayed there for hours, a lone, motionless figure in the dawn light, as the sun rose on the wreckage of his life. He was about to give in to despair when he saw it. A thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke curling up from the center of the debris pile. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through him. The cellar, the chimney stack was stone, and it might have created a pocket, an air hole. He started digging. He dug with his bare hands, the snow and splinters tearing at his flesh, his muscles screaming in protest. He dug with the fury of a madman, driven by a single fragile possibility. After what felt like an eternity, his fingers hit something hard. Wood, the cellar door. He cleared the snow away and pulled, his every muscle straining. The door opened, and from the darkness below, he heard a baby cry. They were alive. Hattie, Alara, and all three children. They were cold, terrified, and covered in dust, but they were alive. He helped them out, one by one, into the morning light. Alara emerged last, Caleb's daughter in her arms, her face streaked with tears and soot. She looked at Silas, her eyes saying everything her words could not. They stood there, a strange, broken family, in the ruins of the cabin, surrounded by a world of white. The broken Caleb was gone, buried under the snow, finally at peace. Quinn's reign was over, his house in ashes, his body likely with it. The ledger in Silas's coat would clear Ilara's name forever and ensure the land. Caleb's legacy would go to his daughter. They had survived. Against all odds, they had survived. Silas looked at Ilara, at the three innocent girls, at his sister Hattie. He looked at the mountain that had taken so much, but had also given them a chance to be free. The cabin was gone, but they could rebuild. The past was a scar, but they could heal. He reached out and gently touched the cheek of Caleb's daughter. In her face, he saw his brother's eyes. He saw the future. "Welcome home," he whispered. Spring finally came to Granger Ridge for good. The last of the avalanche snow melted away, revealing the rich, dark earth beneath. The air, once thick with tension and the smell of gunpowder, was now filled with the scent of pine and wild blossoms. They rebuilt the cabin, not as it was, but stronger, larger, with stones from the avalanche itself. It was no longer just Silas's home. It was a testament to their survival. Word came from the valley that Joseph Quinn's body had been found in the ashes of his mansion. With the ledger Silas provided, the corrupt judge and sheriff were arrested by federal marshals. The truth of Quinn's crimes came out, and the land, the vast tracts he had stolen, was broken up and given back to the families he had terrorized. Ilara's name was cleared, and her daughter, whom she named Callie, after Caleb, was declared the sole heir to her father's claim. The other two girls, Anna and Rose, were eventually reunited with their birth families, two mothers who had thought their children were lost forever. The hearth at Granger Ridge, they called the new cabin. It became a way station, a place of refuge for travelers crossing the treacherous snowhorns. Ilara's quiet grace and Hattie's sharp wit, combined with Silas's silent strength, made it a place of legend, a place where the coffee was hot, the stew was hearty, and the ghosts of the past were kept at bay by the warmth of a fire that never went out. One evening years later, Silas sat on the porch, watching a young Callie chase fireflies in the twilight. She had her father's spirit, a fierce, joyful light in her eyes. Ilara came and sat beside him, her hand finding his, their fingers lacing together in a gesture as natural as breathing. They had never spoken of love, not in grand words. They didn't need to. They had lived it. They had forged it in fire and ice. "He would be proud of her," Ilara said softly. "He would be proud of you," Silas replied, his voice a low rumble. He looked out at the vast, silent mountains that stood guard over their valley. The world was still a hard place, full of storms and shadows. But here, on this ridge, they had built something good from the wreckage. They had taken a story of darkness and rewritten its ending. They had proven that even in the harshest winter, after the most violent storm, life finds a way. A family can be more than blood, and a home can be built not with timber and nails, but with courage, sacrifice, and the stubborn refusal to let the darkness win. This story is a reminder that the deepest scars often hide the greatest strength, and the most unlikely heroes are the ones who show up when the storm is at its worst. They are the quiet ones, the broken ones, the ones who have every reason to give up but choose to fight instead. If you believe that courage can be found in the darkest of places and that one person's stand can change the world, then you found the right channel. Subscribe and hit that bell because we have a lot more stories of grit, guts, and justice from the wild heart of the frontier, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thanks for listening.